The Sunday New York Times a few weeks ago had a front page section that featured an in-depth treatment of 7 of the men who were indicted with multiple felonies in connection with the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. I so appreciated that piece. We think about the whys and we think why in global and national terms. Here was a portrait of 7 individuals, the textures of their personal life. Here was a treatment of the question why on a personal level. So many of those people who were arrested in that attack, they had no connection with extremist groups. Some even had no history of political engagement. And the why question hangs so heavily in the air. Every single one of those men had a reputation for being a good, faithful neighbor, an attentive parent, a good citizen, and a faithful churchgoer. Why? Why would such persons participate in such a thing? The case that really moved me was of a man named Clayton Mullins, a 54-year-old small business owner from Kentucky. He was charged with multiple felonies, including pulling on the leg of a fallen, injured police officer in order to keep him out of the way of other officers who are coming to his assistance. When we meet him, he is sitting with a New York Times reporter in the small church that has been his church since the time of his childhood. The church is not thriving, but Mr. Mullen is honoring a request from his dying mother that he keep the church going. So he is its primary funder, its handyman, its treasurer. And as he sits in that service, as he sits in that place sacred to him and his family, the why question hung in the air then, and he begins to weep. Mr. Mullen begins to weep because he does not know why. He never intended to go to Washington. It was a last-minute thing. And although he voted for Trump, he was never politically engaged and never even listened to social media or the news. The one thing that his friends and families all agree on is that he only had a strong opinion on one thing, and that is that he knew Jesus as his Lord and Savior, but that he had opinions on almost nothing else. He certainly never planned to participate in a riot, and even his decision to go to Washington, that was last minute. He and his wife decided it would be fun to see the Capitol as tourists, and a bonus would be to hear President Trump speak for the last time. Mr. Mullins, you see, believed that Trump had lost the election, fair and square. And so when he and his family arrive at the rally, they only get to stay in the far back and they hardly even hear what Trump is saying. But the next thing you know, they are caught up in a long stream of people headed towards the Capitol. And there you see the photos. There's Mr. Mullins on top of a balustrade. There's Mr. Mullen physically interfering with the people trying to help the wounded man. This story is so frightening to me. It's more frightening to me than those about known extremists, because Mr. Mullen was an ordinary person. Mr. Mullen only had to take one small step into that stream in order to be completely carried away. As Rita Dove writes in her recent work, Playlist for the Apocalypse, truth says that these are arrogant times. Believers slaughter their doubters, while the greedy oil their lips with excuses, and the righteous turn merciless, and the merciful turn mad. But I also find hope in this story. I find hope that he realized somehow, sitting in that sacred space, that he had done something that was contradictory to his faith convictions. Sitting in that church, he wept, and he said, "We should have never gone." Tell us, when will this be, and what will the signs be that all of these things are about ready to be accomplished? So when Jesus discovers the disciples admiring the great temple of Jerusalem, he reminds them that even these magnificent buildings will one day be complete rubble. The disciples, of course, ask, when will this take place? When will the end times arrive? And while Jesus mentions many sign-like events, there are no actual signs in that passage. There will be wars and rumors of wars, but those don't actually point to the end. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes, there will be famine, but none of those actually signal the end. The only thing signaled, we are told, is the beginning of birth pains. What are those birth pains but the beginning of a new beginning? I believe that Jesus here is revealing how the end times aren't just something waiting for us at the end of historical time. They exist outside it and beyond it. Possibly the apocalypse exists both before, after, and during whatever point it is when our clocks stop working. The revelation, the showing, the apocalypse, it's always and already arriving. And we are accompanying it even as it accompanies us. As Rita Dove put it so beautifully, the apocalypse does have a playlist, and we are it. If we took this teaching seriously, think what would happen. We would no longer confuse the transient with the permanent. To do so is to make a mistake that is at least the twin of idolatry. It gives eternal qualities to just human constructs, and it's a mistake. It's a mistake that can only lead us to despair. It only allows us to imagine that injustices and corruptions are permanent and not changeable. If we took this teaching seriously, we would understand that even to imagine the ways in which empire falls apart is to challenge it. Sometimes when we look at the cultural and religious divides in this country, it can seem as if nothing will ever change. But it has, and it will. It has changed, and it is changing. And we play a part of that, not only with our actions, but also with our religious imagination. I presume that the reason that the disciples waited to ask Jesus about the end times until they were in private is because to even speak of the destruction of the temple was to commit an act against empire. And I don't know what that means, except again, to know that to imagine the destruction of empire is to begin the undertaking of the work. These abhorrent congruences that we've experienced between American nationalism, white supremacy, some forms of evangelicalism, those intersections which fueled Clayton Mullen's attack on the Capitol, they're powerful, they're rooted in history, they're compelling, and they're horrifying. But they are no more permanent, no more part of the divine order of things than the grand buildings of empire that were known to Jesus and his disciples. So what are we called to do as people of faith in this time? Well, we could do worse than to heed the call that Rita Dove places in the mouth of the Lady of Liberty, the call to visit her. Rita Dove tells us that she's tired. She's so tired that she's imagining better statue work. She wants to work in a park or work in a church where she can just kind of prevail quietly over a fountain. But she needs us to visit her, To ascend the crown is what Rita Dove asks us to do, and gaze out on the world that we are ordained to watch over. When one imagines all of the historical moments that the Lady Liberty has witnessed, we understand again the nature of transience, and we understand that eternity belongs only to the true and the good and the holy itself. Our task is to help lift that lamp, not to be it, and to shine light on all of the areas of governance, opportunity, and human worth and dignity. Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down.